Welcome to Modern Anarchy, the podcast featuring real conversations with conscious objectors to the status quo. I'm your host, Nicole.
I tried to keep her quiet, but she's screaming inside of me. I tried to keep her hiding, oh, shut up. I tried to keep her quiet, but she's a wild, wild woman.
On today's episode, we have somatic sex educator and sexological body worker, Cassie Porter, join us for a conversation about moving towards pleasure through sex work. Together we talk about destigmatizing sex work, exploring our kinks, and my fears of a monogamous sex life. Oh man, that is a conversation I've had multiple times on this podcast and is one I'm still continuing to explore, right, in my own personal life and with my research. So yeah, that will be a conversation that probably comes back, y'all, multiple times. But this was such a fun conversation with Cassie, and I really appreciated all of the honesty and the vulnerability that she brought into this conversation about being a sex worker, right? There's a lot of stigma. There's a lot of assumptions about what a sex worker is and what they do and why they do their work. So I really appreciate that Cassie came on to talk honestly about her experience and the healing that she found through sex work. This is a really powerful story and a fun conversation that I hope all of y'all enjoy. Tune in. Also, yeah, before we start, like, do you have any questions too? Like, we can really take this anywhere. I was just
Yeah.
rolling.
I mean, so it seems like it's just kind of like free flowing, just okay, and just chatting about what comes up. And
Yeah.
okay, urge to ask you if there were questions. I'm like, I'm just gonna roll with it and just speak to what feels important and authentic. So
Absolutely. And also feel free to ask me any questions too. It doesn't have to feel like an interview, so we can like make it more of a conversation as well. So
okay,
definitely take it anywhere you want. Yeah.
yeah, awesome. Well, I really love what you're doing.
Thank you. Thank you. That's very kind. Is there we could talk about the earth energy, or is there anything you want to talk about specifically on this space that maybe you came into today thinking about?
Yeah, I think more so than earth energy, I want to talk about bodies, and I want to talk
Yeah.
about sexuality, and I want to talk about the work that I do, which is somatic sex education and sexological body work.
Mm-hmm.
And so I touch genitals for pleasure as part of my work. And I also was kind of feeling into, talking about sex work
Okay.
as a viable healing modality, and the stigma around that, and really kind of what the space offers for people and how it's so different than the conceptions that people have around it.
Absolutely. 100%. Yep. I would love to talk about all of these topics with you for sure. Let's see here. Well, then first, could you tell me a little bit about what you do, just generally?
Yeah, absolutely. So I am a somatic sex educator and sexological body worker. And so essentially, I support people with moving toward sexual wholeness and moving toward pleasure, healing from sexual trauma, and doing that through a somatic approach, and which includes and can include touch. It doesn't include touch for everyone, but most of the folks that I work with do opt for some form of touch.
Mm-hmm.
And so I touch a lot of bodies, and I touch bodies of all genders, all orientations, and most of my clients are women, trans folks, non-binary folks, queer folks. So I really, kind of center those folks. I do a lot of gender exploration.
Ooh.
So people who like are getting the sense like that they don't fit into the binary, and having a safe space to explore that, and to have a full expression of their eroticism that's not determined by the dominant culture, right? And all of the embedded kind of heteronormative scripts.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I have a queer client who, identifies as genderqueer, is a vulva owner, but also wants to explore their energetic penis. And
Yeah.
so being able to, kind of connect in with that more masculine energy, being able to celebrate that and allow that to be, kind of part of their authentic sexual expression.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, that sounds like incredibly meaningful work. I can imagine being a part of such an intimate aspect of people's identity can be so meaningful to support.
Yeah, it's really fucking amazing.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. That is the right response. Yes.
and, and really juicy. And
Oh,
it's like I
yeah.
really have a dull day at work, right? Like
Yes.
always so different. And I feel so honored to hold
Mm,
this facet of people's lives. And then I
absolutely.
definitely feel like it's a calling of like
Mm,
I couldn't really do anything else, or if I did that I would be kind of miserable because
mm,
this is just the work that I'm supposed to do. And it took me a while to
yeah.
find it. But then once I found it, it was like, oh yeah, like this is
Yeah.
supposed to do in this lifetime.
Absolutely. Would you be willing to share a little bit more about that journey of listening and finding the calling for you?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I guess what I would start with is that I grew up kind of as a depressed kiddo, and I was the youngest of five girls. And I just always like didn't feel good about myself. I felt like I had really low self-esteem. I felt kind of broken, and I just sort of didn't understand why. And then later in life, I found out that there was sex abuse
Mhm.
happening in my family, and it was happening at a time that I was too young to actually remember. So throughout my adult life, I experienced like all sorts of problematic sexual behavior, just behaving in ways and um yeah, finding myself doing things that I'm like that I didn't understand and that I felt out of control of.
Yeah.
And then always having like a huge amount of shame,
Mm,
like a completely debilitating amount of shame. And I didn't realize until later in life when the shame started to lift that I could actually name it of like, oh, I've been feeling completely shameful about myself, my body, who I am for my
yeah.
entire, and that was like so profound. So I started on my own healing journey and did, sort of therapy and healed to a certain extent. And I recognized it was like I could talk about all the things of like, oh, these things happened in my family, and oh, these are things that I'm experiencing, and okay, this is how I feel about it, and all of those sort of talk therapy things, but I still felt broken.
Mm,
And I still felt that it's just like a lead weight of shame in
wow.
like it's very specific, like located in my belly and just heavy. And so I did some searching and I found a somatic sex educator named Kath and Jesse. And they are a total revolutionary, brilliant, queer, amazing, loving soul that I am so grateful to know. And they just retired recently.
Mm,
And so I decided to attend a workshop that they were facilitating up in British Columbia. And it was called an intimacy educator workshop. And I guess the part I didn't mention is, kind of parallel to my healing, I decided to pursue a master's degree in counseling.
mm,
Um, and so I had started counseling, and there was this sense of like, oh, I can only go so far with my clients. And also this sense of like, this isn't maybe it's not quite the right fit for me, or it felt like I wasn't quite in the right spot. So it was like this training, it was like, for personal healing, but also to kind of step into learning how to work with the body and yeah, starting to work with touch. So I was like
Mhm.
on a personal healing level and then also on a professional level. And so I attended this training and we were all kind of staying in a home that they owned. And so it was an intense, small, really kind of like sacred space. And in that space, we practiced touching in each other in the ways that we ask for and only the ways that we ask for.
Mm.
And so I found myself asking for kinds of touch that surprised me and that really what I wanted was to like be held with love and compassion and gentle touch and be told that I was okay.
Mm.
And so there was a co-facilitator there that worked with me individually. And it was like, we had a session where it was like my body was completely listened to. And it was like, I felt like I shed a lifetime of shame
Wow.
in that session and in that experience. And it was like, oh shit, like this is really powerful, you know? And it was like, it was profound for me. And then I recognized it was like, oh, this is the work that I need to be doing. Um,
Wow.
and so I remember riding home on the ferry from BC and just like so ignited around
Mm.
like I need to get my certification. I need to start doing this work. And
Yeah.
so I've been doing this work since, let's see. Well, I mean, there's another part to the story, but I guess since it's like an Anarchy podcast,
I like where this is going.
the status quo that maybe it would be, because it's interesting. I have different versions of the story.
I love that. Yes.
Like that's kind of the version that is so respectable and like professional and like wraps it up neatly and I guess the other part of the story and I guess this really ties into what I feel passionate about to talk to people about is that at the same time I started counseling, I also started doing sex work. And I initially it was like, oh, I'm gonna do this thing while I get my counseling practice going. And very quickly it was like, I would see sex work clients during the day and then like counsel people at night, which is you would think it would be the opposite,
Yes. Yeah.
but it wasn't. I was like, sex worker by day, counselor by night. And then I realized like the profound difference in those spaces and how I was so much more ignited and there was just such a potency to working with the body and working with touch and holding space for the entire person. So pretty quickly I essentially kind of transitioned into doing full-time touch work in the form of erotic massage. And it's kind of funny because like counseling was the perfect cover for that because I'd be like, "Oh yeah, mom, I got 4 clients today. I'm done at this." You know, everyone and it took me a while to really, come out to people in my life around it. At the time, only a couple of close friends knew. And then for all my family knew, it was like, oh, Cassie is now a successful counselor because like I was killing it financially.
Mhm.
I had all this abundance and it was like, oh, I had this client practice and I had, had this space that I worked in. And so it really was a brilliant cover for quite some time. And then it's like, I realized it's like, it kind of didn't matter. Like the details don't matter because it's like I was doing and am doing healing work. Right. And it's like, I do see sex work and whether it be, here's maybe where I want to talk about like whorephobia and what we call the whorearchy
Yep.
of like, you know, like being a sexological body worker, like, oh, you're certified, somehow it's more palatable to people. Or like, even though it's a little on the fringes, people can kind of like wrap their mind around it or be like, oh, you're doing this like legit thing, right? That is now on like Sex, Love, and Goop, like the Gwyneth Paltrow show.
Mhm.
So it's like we're having a moment of like people recognizing who we are and what we're doing. But also it's like sex workers that are doing full service, that are working underground, that are marginalized. It's like those spaces are just as potent, right? And so it's like I really think it's important to destigmatize touch-based work and to recognize the legitimacy and the power and the healing potential of being able to have a space to be touched erotically. Like,
Mm-hmm.
I really feel passionate about that. And I still feel like there is so much stigma around sex work and like misconceptions, right? Of like, oh, it's just somebody on the street, like in high heels and a short skirt that's being pimped and is a drug addict. And then like, and that the people who frequent sex workers are these sleazy dudes that are middle-aged, and it's like, it's that's so far from the truth. The reality is that sex workers come in all forms and shapes and sizes and colors and economic backgrounds and cultural backgrounds. There's sex worker here in our community. I know a sex worker who's in her 70s,
Wow.
right? Yeah. And then it's like clients that I've seen, range anywhere from, 19 years old, 20 years old to like 90 years old.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like my 90-year-old was a professor or had been a professor at this like prestigious college, and it's like, yeah, women, trans folks, like people of all cultures, people of all races, and people of all socioeconomic backgrounds, right? Of like, there's like super wealthy folks. And I think that's also kind of the stereotype in some ways of like the pretty woman thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Like, super high class, and then Julia Roberts gets like rescued from
Yeah.
like the terribleness of sex. It's interesting. I loved that movie growing up, but
Mm.
I grew up in the 80s. So yeah, it's like I do feel sex work is something that is powerful. Touch-based work is powerful, and
Absolutely.
that I really believe in and I feel passionate about advocating for.
100%. Yeah, I mean, I think the hypocrisy of the dynamic is this like classist struggle where we can see that it's okay on Goop, but then when we think about other scenarios and what we imagine in our head, that's not okay, right? Like we see that power dynamic happening right there where like one scenario is okay, one's not. And I think it's just a highlight to the hypocrisy of the whole thing. And also,
Yeah.
I mean, I think people, this is why I love getting to have as my cat bites my arm viciously, pushing that thing away. um, this is why I also love holding this space because I think a lot of people don't talk to sex workers. A lot of people don't know a sex worker. So getting to have this space where we can talk about your story, talk about your experience, it provides, a real human to imagine rather than all of the stereotypes in the media that's out there that portrays sex work in a very negative light.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's like something I was thinking about was that probably like most people know someone who is a sex worker or know someone who has been to a sex worker and they don't realize it
Absolutely, 100%. Yes.
because so many sex workers, it's not safe. It's not safe to be out. It's not safe to just be like, oh, just like if you're a I'm a doctor. It's like it's not culturally acceptable on a general level, but then more importantly, it's like a matter of safety, right?
Absolutely.
Like, oh, you can lose your housing or, like alienate your family, those kinds of things. And so I think it's like probably pretty much everyone knows a sex worker and just doesn't know that they know them.
100%. I would definitely agree with that. I think, yeah, there's so much protection that is needed because of the legal system, because of all of the problematic structures that we have that don't support sex work, that it's a thing of safety. So, yeah, I think you're 100% in that. We all probably know a sex worker that maybe just isn't safe enough to talk and to bring it up into the light. And so I'm really thankful that you're in this space talking about this. So thank you. And
Oh,
yeah, I was thinking also, I wanted to thank you for sharing your story about your childhood and coming to learn about your experience and to move through that and be able to name shame and what that was in your body, the lead weight. That's a very strong illustration of how much you felt in your body from that experience. Could you
yeah.
tell me a little bit more about that? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and honestly, like, something I was gonna say as you were talking is that, like, I felt like starting to do sex work was the beginning of the true healing journey from the shame, it's like, I don't know what happened, like, I don't have explicit memories,
Mm,
I don't know, like, I
yeah.
just don't know, but what I have come to know and what I have feels really true after doing research about, kind of early childhood trauma and complex PTSD and like the ways I would show up and like depression that I experienced. It's like I could recognize that it's like, okay, this is something that impacted me. And it's like, as I was talking about, like that it felt elusive, right? Of like,
Mm,
no matter how I kind of like poked at it or talked about it or tried to shine a light on it, it was very elusive. And it's interesting because it's like I didn't step into doing sex work going like, oh, this is going to be really healing for me. And then I'm going to find my calling through this. But something that was profoundly like, I found myself really starting to heal because it's like, oh, here I am in the space and I get to set the rules, like I get to say exactly what this space entails, what it doesn't entail. And then over time it was like, oh, I can say no. Um,
mhm,
I can set boundaries. I can decide not to see someone, if that person doesn't feel safe. So it's like all of that just really started to empower me on this really sort of deep embodied erotic level in a
mm,
way that, like started, I think it just started to rewire my nervous system from this place of implicit kind of helplessness
absolutely.
that I think had just been there throughout my life, of a place of like total shame, groundlessness, kind of
Mm,
never feeling like I was okay, never really
wow.
feeling belonging, all of those things were wired in there. And then it was like I started to find this sense of autonomy and this sense of power and
Mm,
being empowered and being able to have agency over my world and to also like connect with people on such a deep level, right?
absolutely.
Like a concept I really resonate with is sacred intimacy.
Mm,
It's like that space, it's like a space of just pure connection that has nothing to do with like social constructs or like, oh, I met you here and now we're dating. And so there's all these loaded, kind of negotiations and sort of mind reading or, like having to guess how the other person feels. Or it's like within this space of sacred intimacy, it's like just purely showing up with another human
mm,
with unconditional compassion,
mhm,
care, and adoration. And for me, it really does feel like a spiritual practice of like whatever body walks through my door, and whether this was a erotic massage sex work
mhm,
client, or whether it's the work I currently do with people around sexual trauma healing, it's like whatever body arrives, it's like I try to meet that person with a sense of pure love and compassion
mm,
and acceptance, right? And it's like having that flow through me, it's like, oh, like that actually is really healing. And it's like
yeah,
a really, it's been a really great practice, of like, oh, I get to like practice this like really deep kind of unconditional acceptance, even if it's like somebody has a stinky body or somebody has a really large body or somebody has like they're covered in hair.
mhm,
It's
sure,
like
yeah.
bodies are so interesting, right?
Mm,
so many bodies, and it's like I can find appreciation and adoration and love for all of them, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, we're always going to have our thoughts, these automatic, biases or whatever that come up. And I think the important thing that you're hitting on, and I always try to tell myself too, is that it's a choice, right? We can have those thoughts. We can't choose what we automatically think, but we choose how we act. And so, yes, 100%, it's a practice to be constantly, or not constantly, but actively trying to channel in that love and compassion, that focus, that perspective, rather than the thoughts that float around in our head. And that's always a choice. So
Yeah.
yes, 100%, that is great. It is a good practice to be in that state of inviting that. And yeah, it sounds like this has been such a powerful journey to gaining a sense of control. You were talking about the power dynamics of you being able to set boundaries and set this is what is going to happen in this space, and this is what I'm okay with, and this is what we're going to do together. And that sounds like it was a very empowering experience for you.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's like until then, it was always like I was just so starved or hungry for a sense of like connection or like
Mm.
belonging, that it was like, oh, I'll just like take what I can get. And I found myself in abusive relationships, relationships where I was being very poorly treated,
Mm.
relationships where I was being actively like cheated on, actively humiliated, like and now I look back and I'm just like, how it's like it feels like it's not even me anymore, right? Of like, how was that okay? Like how was it
Mhm.
okay? And I try to, it's like a little shame bubbles up when I
Mm.
think about like things that happened maybe, 10, 15 years ago. It was like there was this period in my life where it was like, every like I call it kind of being off the rails, right? Of
Mm.
just like life was kind of chaotic. I was partying a lot. Like what I wasn't, taking great care of myself. I hadn't really dealt with my mood disorder.
Mm.
And so I found myself with these really toxic men and it's like, oh, now as I look back, I understand why, right?
Mm.
I understand. So it's like the shame bubbles up, and then it's like, okay, I need to extend compassion for myself because that's just where I was in my journey. And now I'm in a different place. And now it's like I have found a beautiful, wonderful partner who is incredibly loving, incredibly
Mm.
consistent and grounded and supportive. And I think had I not healed the sort of, sexual trauma stuff, it's like I wouldn't have been able to, connect with that kind of partner. And so it's like interesting how, that parallel of like where you are in your healing and then the kinds of people that you sort of draw in and find yourself around. And so, yeah,
Absolutely, 100%. I mean,
like you resonate with that.
yes, 100%, I resonate with that. And also, just even the concept of draw in, it is so not our fault, right? Like, I even want to challenge that language. Like, we are not drawing these people in. We're so used to these patterns, right? This is what has been enacted for us before of how relationships are, of how we should expect to be treated. And it's so hard because when you're in that state, I mean, we're all constantly healing, right? So I don't want to say like when we're unhealed, like we're all healing, but in that state, it's almost like we crave that dynamic, kind of almost like an addict kind of like mentality of like, I crave this thing that is actively destroying me, but not being able to see that at the same time. It's so hard in that space.
Yeah, absolutely. And something I've noticed in my clients, and then it's like, oh, that was happening for me too, is that like often with sexual trauma, it's like in on a subconscious level, our body mind is trying to move toward wholeness.
Mm-hmm.
It's like that's the like we're wired to try to experience a sense of integration and wholeness, whether we explicitly have that intention or not. And so the brilliance of our bodies is that we're like, oh, there's something back there that I need to heal, or oh, there's something in this like sex space that I need to sort through. And so our bodies are drawn toward these experiences because we're trying to have a corrective experience.
Yep.
And so then often it's like, this is why I think kink can be so healing for people. And I've found this time and time again with my clients, is that they get drawn to these things. And it's like, sometimes there's like shame around it, but then it's like, oh, you actually can reframe this entire, it's like, oh, you get to be tied up and powerless, but you get to do it on your terms.
Absolutely.
Right? Or like, oh, you're drawn to be restrained or choked or, you know, whatever the kink is. It's like you can approach that in a way that is totally empowered, and through that allow that trauma, like basically kind of almost go back and like neurologically sort of repattern from the
Mm-hmm.
thing that happened before. So
Mm-hmm.
I just often hold up for people the brilliance of our bodies and the resilience and then also like this thing around, sometimes it's like people have these turn-ons and they're just like, oh, like why am I turned on by that, or oh, this doesn't make sense. But then it's like often what happens, it's like the brilliance of our bodies, we subconsciously like turn super traumatic, troubling experiences into erotic.
Mm.
So it's like reframing those things that, someone might be drawn to, of like, I've had clients where it's like, oh, I see violence on TV and I get totally wet. And
Mm.
like that's, I feel totally ashamed about that. And so that's gross. And like really it's like, oh, you had violence, perpetrated towards you. And the way that you survived is to turn that into pleasure. So it's like, I think it's really important for people to know that, because I think it's like people have a lot of shame around the ways they respond sexually. And it's like, if you've had trauma, chances are it's like, it's just your own resilience coming through. And like, how
Mhm.
cool that our bodies are like, oh, this is terrible. And so, okay, I'm going to rewire so that this thing actually feels pleasurable.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. It's a survival response.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, and that's, I don't know. There's so many different ways I could take this. I'm curious if that's something that you've experienced in your own body and something that you've felt through your own personal journey.
Yeah, this is really vulnerable, and I think I'll go ahead and share it.
Mm-hmm.
I was recently talking to a friend about this who has a similar turn on.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so I have this turn on, and I've always had it. Like, it's interesting, from my very first boyfriend at 17
Yeah.
to now my current husband, and we're in a married monogamous relationship, because that's what works for both of us and our nervous systems. It's like, it's like, it's funny because people think as like someone working in the realm of sex that I'm like super kinky and like polyamorous, and like I celebrate all of that, and it's just not what feels good for me, right? And so I, throughout my life, have been very turned on thinking about my partner having sex with someone else, like right in front of me, right? And so it's like really erotically charged. And what I've connected is that it's like, you know, in my past, there's been forms of abandonment.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's like turning that abandonment into a turn on, right? And I
Mm-hmm.
didn't consciously do that. It wasn't like, oh yeah, I'm gonna like try to get excited about this thing so that I can feel better or heal something. But it's like, oh, and I was really ashamed about that turn
Oh,
for a long time. And I was even in safe spaces and at times, and it's like, as part of my somatic sex education journey and training, we really kind of dig deep into our own stuff. And it was
yeah.
like, I felt really ashamed
Mm.
that was what turned me on. But then now I'm like, oh, like no wonder I'm turned on by that, of like, yeah, I've been left and just, stuff. Everybody's got daddy stuff.
Yeah.
yeah, that like dad abandonment. But then it's like, okay, so let me make abandonment and just like, oh, leaving you over in the corner while I go have sex with somebody. Let's make that a turn on. So
Absolutely.
I have experienced that.
Yeah.
And it's interesting. I'll share. I mean, maybe this will be kind of funny. So my husband, he grew up in a Christian cult. And so he, from a young age, was just like, okay, this is bullshit. But it was one of those cults where it's like, if you don't go along with it, then you get excommunicated and you never get to see your family again. Right. Like they can't even talk to you.
Wow.
He meets me and then he's just, we fall in love and he's just like, oh shit. It's like, basically, I have to choose between being with you and like having a family. Right. So
Wow.
he chose me, but then and I had guilt about that for a while, like, oh, I caused you to lose your family. But he's like, no, I was going to leave anyway. It was just a matter of time. So anyway, it's like his mom is kind of a stalker.
Just kind of what?
So she has never even bought, I mean, it's like he got immediately ostracized. They don't even talk to him.
Hmm.
And this has been 5 years now, right?
Wow.
And so it's funny because when I've had a few podcast interviews and different spaces where I've talked kind of openly about sex work and my journey, and it's like there's this little part of me that's just like, oh, his mom is listening. And I kind of don't care, right? But then there's this like, I think it's like, yeah, I feel really empowered in talking about it. And then it's just like, I know it's like she's probably gobbling it all up and just like seething.
Ooh. Yes, you feel her presence.
I mean, maybe it's kind of fun of just like, yep, you can go ahead and believe that I'm the devil and that I like corrupted your son or, made him stray from the Lord or whatever bullshit, way you want to put it. But
Uh-huh, uh-huh. I mean, in her eyes, you're a sex witch, you know? I mean, come over here, you know?
yeah, so lastly, if you're out there, you can fuck off.
I love the energy. I mean, hey, this is your relationship, your empowerment, your life. You know what I mean? Like, no.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. I
Yeah.
appreciate you sharing all that. I mean, I would love to talk to your husband. That's probably a very, very interesting story, all of the journeys that he's gone through. I can't even imagine.
Yeah. Yeah. He's definitely, yeah, been on a journey. And it's funny because I think I have more feelings about it than he does. Because he's just kind of like, yeah, I'm fine now. Everything's good. And I don't have bad feelings toward my parents. And, he's very, but I do feel like there's a little bit of like, just sort of wrapping things up, right? And just not really wanting to, like dissect everything or to,
Yeah,
I think it's a way of coping of like,
sure.
okay, I'm gonna close the door and just be like, oh, I'm okay. I don't need to talk about it kind of thing.
Absolutely.
To accept that, because I was just so angry at his family. And I'm like, why are you not angry? And then he would be mad at me for being so like, like upset and like so like I felt like harsh towards his family because I just don't understand. But over time, it's like, okay, that's just my response. And he has a different experience and he has love for them and like, and all of that can be, and that I don't need to be mad on his behalf.
Absolutely. And I mean, at the core of that, you love and care for him and you want to keep him safe. So, that drives that protection to, yeah, what is going on here? Why are you still with them? And that sort of energy. So, I mean, it's all coming back to that love and care for him.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
Yeah. I personally have my own fears and questions I want to bring up into this space.
Okay.
Because you were talking about monogamy and poly, like, okay, I have this huge fear that if I was monogamous with someone for the rest of my life, that sex would become boring and I would hate it. So curious if you could solve that huge problem or what your thoughts are on it, how long you've been with your partner and what, what your experience is.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, that's a great
Yeah.
I think something that humanity has wrestled with, right? When it was like expected that everyone was monogamous, it's
Yep.
like people still weren't monogamous. And it's because of that reason of like wanting the novelty and the excitement, right? So I've worked with couples quite a bit who are kind of struggling with this same thing and like, finding themselves in monogamous relationships, but then having things sort of either be disconnected or out of sync sexually, or fizzling out, right? And so really it's a matter of having to work at it. Right?
Mm.
Just having to consciously like make time for intimacy and make time for pleasure, uh,
Yeah.
and be in tune to each other's desires. And it is work, right?
Mm.
Like it so I think it's like people who are monogamous, it's like, you have to be kind of willing to either put in the work or willing to maybe have things become less fiery over time. And a
Mm.
lot of people are totally content with that. Of like,
Yeah.
okay, yeah, like especially older couples, it's like, and some people are just feel okay with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But if you're not okay with that, it's like there's definitely ways to, sort of keep things fresh. And somatic sex education offers a lot of tools for that
Mm-hmm.
because it's based on the idea. It's like it's not just about like penetrative sex. It's about being yeah.
Jesus. Yeah. Can we talk about that? Wow.
And it's just like people, they just think of like sex. Oh, sex means penetrative sex, and both people have to be really turned on. And if like they're not totally turned on, both of them, and they don't orgasm, like something is wrong, right? And like that is pretty ridiculous because we all are wired so differently and we have different arousal patterns and different times of day that we like feel more excited, and like to expect all of that to line up perfectly and for there just fireworks to go off on like a tri-weekly basis or something, it's just like it's unreasonable. And so just
Mm-hmm.
getting real about that, and then just starting to create space for each person to get their needs met, and like being curious about like, so there's an exercise in somatic sex education called essentially it's called bossy massage. And so essentially the person who's receiving gets to ask for the kinds of touch that they want, and they don't think about how the other person wants to touch them. They think solely about, what do I want? So the person who's giving the touch is like, how would you like to be touched? And so someone might be like, oh, I'd like you to caress my hair, and then slowly drag your fingertip down over my breasts. And so the other person just exquisitely does that, and then asks the other person of like, what would make this better? Would faster or slower be better? Would harder or softer be better? And so just learning to attune to your partner and to gather information about what they want and to meet those needs. And there's some really awesome resources. So all of this kind of comes from the work of Dr. Betty Martin. Oh, sweet. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So yes. Yeah. And the Wheel of Consent. And so
Mm-hmm.
about the Wheel of Consent, and like, yeah, that sometimes you can just be like in that serving role of like you're serving your partner, and like that can be a really juicy space, and that like, oh, you'll have your turn to accept for your pleasure, right? And then also
Mm-hmm.
like when you're allowing I mean, allowing can be okay as long as you actually feel good about it, but when you're like, you slip into enduring of like, oh, my husband's been touching my clit like this for 20 years and I pretend like I like it, and it actually doesn't feel good. It's like that's enduring bad touch, right? Learning that you don't have to endure. You can just start to communicate with your partner openly, because it's like, yeah, like it's okay if they don't know, because they're not going to know unless you tell them. Like we can't intuit, all of the information from someone's body. I think it's like there's kind of an expectation around that of like, oh, you got to be a good lover, and that means just like reading someone's mind and body, and it's like everyone's body is so different, and turn-ons and types of
Yep.
touch people enjoy. So it's all about creating space for communicating that.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
the more back to your question, the more that that's happening in a monogamous relationship, the more people are feeling like they're getting their needs met. And then also
Mhm.
they can express desires, and maybe the desire is like, hey, I would like to try this kink. I would like, you know, to, have you spank me or whatever the thing is. And then it's like maybe the other person isn't totally excited by it, but they can show up for that desire, and then the needs are met.
Mhm, 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 100%, yeah. I think what was coming up for me was the idea of attunement. You had talked about that. I mean, when I'm thinking about that massage, that's a great thing. Like, if I could recommend anything to listeners, is just like, yeah, set all the expectations aside, sit with your partner and ask them, how do you like to be touched? And just
Yeah.
have that session. Like, just do that, right? And let that experience go wherever it goes and take turns. I think that would radically change a ton of people's sex lives just to slow down that much to that sort
Yeah.
of activity.
Yeah. And taking penetrative sex off the table.
Yes.
Of
Yes.
like, it's not even an option. Like, you need to touch your partner with your hands. And then
Yes.
there's so much sensuality in that, because then it's like, oh, I've never actually been touched this way by you. And it's just activates those, more subtle levels of eroticism.
100%. It's almost like there's sometimes this script to sex. We do little kissing, make out, foreplay, penetration, over, bam, right? For that works and can be something that you do, but that is missing the whole vast spectrum of sexuality, which is
Yeah.
full of creativity and play. Like, this is adult play, adult exploration of our bodies, and it can be in so many different ways without penetration at all. And at the core of that should be pleasure, right? And there can
Yeah.
be pleasure in the softest of touch that even doesn't even touch genitals, right? And we are just too myopically focused on them to even see the vast world of what we can be exploring with partners. Ugh,
Yeah, totally. Totally. It's like a, penetrative sex, it's like a planet, but then
yeah,
there's like a whole galaxy of
absolutely.
ways to connect, right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And when you were talking about monogamy and long-term partnerships, right, where you're getting to know someone's body, I think what was coming up for me was this metaphor of an instrument, right? I mean, if we think of all of our bodies as completely unique instruments with different strings, different chords to play, I mean, part of that takes time, learning, practice of learning
Yes.
how to play that instrument. You want to have a whole performance? I mean, you got to put in the hours to learn what touch, what strumming is
Yeah.
right.
I love that metaphor so much. Yeah, and you're
Hmm.
not gonna nail it right away, right? You're not just gonna, oh, I'm gonna pick up this new instrument and like play this beautiful song, right? Yeah.
Yeah, 100%.
In somatic sex education, it beautifully ties into this other metaphor. I remember from, part of the curriculum, it was like thinking of sex as like a bunch of instruments like jamming together, right? Of like everyone's got their own instrument and you can just jam together, and it's okay that they are all different, right? But then
Absolutely.
yeah, we can play each other's instruments.
Mhm, mhm. Yeah, and there's a uniqueness to that when you're doing that in a monogamous partnership where you do set aside that time to focus on that work. I mean, I love that you use that word work, or I guess discipline, or maybe even a better word that maybe doesn't have so much of a like a intention, maybe
Yeah.
intentional time,
Mhm.
like setting that aside with intention that we are going to spend this time together to build this, even if it isn't one of those like fiery, I'm going to, just whatever, come
Yeah.
together so intensely over time. Yeah, I'm just so
Yeah.
afraid, I'm so deeply afraid. I
Yeah.
Yeah, I find myself leaning, even with all of the studying that I'm doing, like leaning more monogamous in my own orientation at times. And so it's been like an interesting thing to kind of walk through, knowing that I've kind of tried both and trying to
Yeah.
figure out what sits for me. But there's just so much fear that I'd end up in a sexless marriage and like hate that. So
Yeah. Well, and I
yeah,
think that, yeah, like back to the communication of just like, yeah,
yeah.
continuing to have a fresh conversation
Okay,
about what the
yeah.
desires are. And then maybe there's a point where it's like that you can't, it's like, I know a lot of couples who engage sex workers, and they engage sex workers because it's safe. And it's like there's not the potential of these like emotional entanglements. Like it's clear that this is an erotic space, and like there's some couples who they decide to seek out a sex worker erotic massage provider. So it's like, oh, there's not penetration, like, so it's like there's ways
Yeah,
to
for
kind of,
sure.
work within monogamy in a way that kind of keeps that like, that structure, but then allows that little bit of exploration that it's
Absolutely.
so it's like finding the exploration that's safe enough,
Mhm, mhm.
of like, oh, that's safe enough and fits within this container of what we've decided for ourselves, and it's juicy, and that we both want to do it. So it's like I think it's possible, to keep things ignited. But then
Absolutely.
also it's okay. It's like, have you heard of Jack Morin? So he wrote a book called The Erotic Mind. And so I believe he's like a sexologist. I don't know exactly what his background is, but he wrote this book all around eroticism and our brains and turn ons and things like that. And so what he was talking about with couples is that it's like, it's like you meet each other and then you have hot sex, right? It's like hot. And so and that's amazing. And people want that to keep going. It's like people want to keep having hot sex, but the reality is that maybe what you'll have is warm sex. And so
Mm,
thinking about warm sex and like what warm sex can feel like, and like how lovely is warm? Warm is
mm.
lovely, and you could still maybe have some hot. I mean, I'm not saying it's like people are doomed to warm sex, not that it's a doom,
Yeah,
right?
exactly, exactly.
Not a prescription of like, oh, eventually you're going to have warm sex, but also it's like kind of reframing this idea that like, oh, it's like there has to be all of these like fireworks and explosions and like spontaneity and all these things. It's maybe not how real life is for most people and most relationships.
100% in most of our life, right? I mean, even going into like other things outside of sex, careers, we're like, this can be so exciting. And then you get in the day to day of it. And I mean, there's a reality to our experience that isn't always like high intensity stimulus. But I do find it interesting as a society, we are moving towards that more like high stimulus state with, the internet, other things like a ton of dopamine. So I think it will be interesting to see how throughout the changes of even our neurobiology, right, of what we want in terms of like stimulus reward seeking, how that will change our generational differences in monogamy and non-monogamy. At least
Yes.
at least from what
I
I've
think that
seen.
it's so profound. Like
Yeah.
I think so spot on of like our brains are just different. And like, yeah, we want to just digest the like story on our Instagram, and then move on to the next story. Right. Are you doing your dissertation on this? Because I know you're a PhD student, right?
Yeah, Side, but similar. Yeah, so mine's on relationship anarchy, and so part of that is, or do you know about relationship anarchy?
I think I've heard of it, but I don't know exactly
Sure,
what the
sure,
definition
sure.
is.
Yeah, so basic definition is constructing relationships outside of the normative expectations, right? So similar to polyamory, but also a step out to even say, we're going to value our platonic, romantic, and or sexual relationships on a fluidity that feels natural for each relationship. So instead of being like, oh, my sexual partner is the most important one because they're my sexual and romantic and my platonic are just friends, it's trying to have more of that fluidity and lack of hierarchy, but also the malleability to construct relationship agreements on your own accord and what feels good for you,
Yeah.
which I
Yeah.
think
It's
is really
cool.
beautiful. Yeah,
Yeah. It's
absolutely.
so organic. And it's just like, yeah, and if everybody is on board with that co-constructing, then it's like things can just sort of flow in the ways they need to flow, and or that feel good for them to flow.
Absolutely, absolutely, right? And like that might even capture something more so like the partners who were using or going to sex workers for different experiences, right? I mean, it's whatever label feels right for those people, but some people would say that's not monogamy, right? Because you're having a sexual experience outside of your relationship. the end of the day, these are all different labels, whatever we use to fit, right? But I hope people see as we continue to, explore relationships and the different structures as society starts to let go of some of the biases that were just very mononormative, that there's a lot of different ways to do this. There's no right way. Each way is individual for each person and their experience. I've been relating it a lot to having kids, right? Like
Yeah.
you can have 4 kids, you could have no kids. You're going to live radically different lives with different amounts of time, energy, space to dedicate to things, and neither life is right or wrong. They're just different choices of how you want to do this.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and like all of the value judgments about that, I feel like it's just like embedded from like, Christianity and, religion and patriarchy and, and it's just like, oh, if we can just let those dissolve, then we can all just be how we want to be. And like, why not? Like,
Yes.
like, why not just let people be how they want to be? It's like I recently on the news was hearing it's like there's these, I think it's just like far right groups that are just really like amping up against LBGT like
I got you. I got you.
people, and it's like, really? You're so concerned with how people conduct their sexual intimate lives that has nothing to do with you. Yeah, it's just like it's mind blowing. Oh, and that like trans folks are essentially like defiling our children, and that drag shows are disgusting, just like, really, like, let people be how they want to be, let them move towards pleasure in the ways they want to move toward pleasure. It's like, it's so interesting to me how people, it's like they get so fired up or like and it's just like, oh, and I think it's the religion piece, right? And then also I think it's the piece, I think people get so upset because it's like, oh, but wait, I kind of see myself over there, and so if I get really angry about it and then stick to the Lord or whatever it is, then I can still feel okay within myself and fit into this normative Christian culture. Yeah, so
Yeah, the things that really fire people up and bring up a huge response in you, in me, are typically a reflection of what we have not accepted within ourselves.
yeah,
The stuff we have,
absolutely.
yeah, the stuff we have processed through, thought about, that doesn't bring up much for us, We hear, oh yeah. But if it's something that hits in you, that's when we see the fire, that's when we see this response.
Yes, absolutely. And unfortunately, I think it's like a large number of people, it's like they are so far from even taking a look at that, right? Of just like they're so ingrained in this, culture, this mindset that, they're not even willing, or they won't consider that maybe there's something to learn.
Absolutely, absolutely. I hope that we continue to go in the opposite direction of that. You know what I mean?
Yes. Yeah, and
Jeez.
I think it's like it feels like the evolution is happening, right? Like I do feel that. And then something I want to note is that, yeah, over time, as I've done touch-based work, it's like it was very often, cis men that were,
Mm,
felt empowered to step into a space with erotic touch or sexual healing. And like
yeah.
over time, there's been more women, more queer folks, more trans folks, non-binary
Yeah.
folks. And it's like, I think there's more of a sense of like, yeah, like I can empower myself sexually, and I can, evolve and be my best sexual self. And I don't have to, kind of live in the box of normative culture. I can just go for it, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, when I received my own yoni massage, it was profoundly healing as a sexual assault survivor to go through that experience and to have my nervous system relax to the touch of another person. Yeah, it was
Yeah.
profound.
Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. And somebody who's not trying to get something from you,
Exactly.
they're just there
Yes.
to be of service to you.
Yes. It
Yeah.
can be so hard to receive. So hard.
Mm. I'm curious what kind of practitioner you went to, if you don't mind sharing.
Yeah, it was it was actually with one of the people that I recorded on the podcast early on. I think it's like episode 6. So he does yoni massage work and energy work.
Awesome.
Yeah, so it was a really great experience. And I remember even, I think it's profound for me even to talk about it now because when I recorded it on episode 6, I didn't talk about my experience because I think there was this fear as someone going into, the clinical psychology realm, like could there be backlash for me even receiving this service, right? And
Yeah.
going into that. And where I'm at now is radically different now, so I'm like, fuck the system, this is what I do and I'm going to honor that, right? And I'm
Yay.
not going to lie about how healing it was for me to even be empowered to pay for that sort of service to receive pleasure. That's empowering.
Thank you so much for sharing that.
Yeah,
I think that's really beautiful.
thank you.
And
Yeah,
I celebrate your, bravery in sharing.
thank you. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, it makes me feel even more passionate about what I do, of like on a
absolutely.
cultural collective level, like this needs to change. Like
Oh,
this sex and body wound is deep, and
mm-hmm.
it's shrouded in shame and secrecy and like numbness, right? Because there's not space, or there's not enough space for
Absolutely.
that, all of that to be brought into the light so that we can, have what we're talking about, like this flowy, beautiful existence of like being able to connect and have pleasure in the ways that you want without like fear and shame.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I mean, you are battling years of patriarchal thinking and systems.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So thank you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
You're so welcome.
Yeah,
It's
we need more people doing this work and being brave enough to use their voice to talk about it and be open about it, right? I know you talked about the protection and the fear. And so thank you for coming onto this space, for talking about your experience and being so open about it.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
thank you so much for having me and for
Yeah,
creating this space in the first place. And
absolutely.
yeah, what you're doing is really important.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. I do want to ask one closing question that I ask everyone on the podcast. Yeah. And this question is, what is one thing that you wish other people knew was more normal?
So I think that I wish people knew it's normal to be messy,
Mm.
and it's normal to feel broken. It's normal to feel a huge amount of shame. And it's, yeah, normal to not feel like you meet the standards of normative culture.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, that is resonating with me, the messiness, right?
Yeah.
And I mean, look at nature. Look at nature. We see different size. I'm looking at your pothos in the background, but right, we see different size leaves, different patterns. Every single piece is completely different. I mean, think about snowflakes, right? Like every single one is intricate, yet one single snowflake would never meet the normative then, right? I mean, we've constructed these normative patterns on what? Ugh.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's all just like a falsity, right? It's just like it's a illusion, right? Of like this perfection that somehow people need to reach, or these standards that are
Mm-hmm.
set by, I mean, all the oppressive systems, right?
Yep.
Like white supremacy,
Yep.
patriarchy, religion. And it's just like, yeah, I think slowly more and more folks are breaking free of that. And as part of that, yeah, like I really celebrate the messiness. I celebrate
Absolutely.
the imperfection and the
Mm.
rawness and the not enoughness, right?
Hmm. I would say that's the beauty of being a human. In many ways, I think about like fake roses? Why do we give people real flowers that die, compared to just some fake plastic ones? There is the beauty in the fact that it's imperfect, it will die eventually. Part of our human experience is that we are not plastic. We are real creatures with fallible aspects, with maybe a little, hole on our leaves or whatever, and we are all gonna die. I mean, that is the beauty of the human experience.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Love it.
It was so much fun to talk to you and just get to share ideas and share space with you. This was such a pleasure.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.
If you enjoyed today's episode, then leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to your podcast. And if you're a part of the Anarchist community, then follow us on Instagram or nominate a guest for the show by sending in a letter to modernanarchypodcast@gmail.com. Otherwise, I'll see you next week.